Hello and welcome to today's webinar on EU MDR. How do I interpret the new regulations and what do I need to do to be compliant? And folks, I want to give you a gold star because you are unofficially a part of the most popular webinar in the history of the medical device industry. I was sharing that with our presenter Brian a few moments ago. Uh, my name is John Spear, and I'm the founder and VP of Quality and Regulatory here at Greenlight Guru and the moderator for today's event. We've got a really special presentation scheduled for you today. I know our presenter, Brian Hockett, is really looking forward to sharing his expertise on the new EU MDR. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy, R&Q, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for about 60 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Brian has been kind enough to stick around and answer some of your questions. So I would encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we'll get to as many of them as time permits. Second, I just want to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know that we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. Likely a similar mission as many of you and your companies that are participating in today's webinar. So anything that we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultancies like R&Q, or through our award-winning quality management software platform. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies all over the globe in more than 600 cities from over 50 countries are ditching their broken paper-based quality systems and outdated legacy software for a new modern quality management software platform designed exclusively from the ground up for the medical device industry by medical device professionals, then I would encourage you to head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation and request your free personalized one-on-one demo. In the demo, you will learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging the Greenlight Guru EQMS software to gain ISO 13485 2016 certification, breeze through audits and inspections, and push beyond compliance to focusing on true quality. So like I said, if you're interested in learning how we might be able to help your device company, be sure to go over to www.greenlight.guru after today's session and schedule your free personalized demo. Finally, if you're going to be attending MD&M West here in a few weeks, February 5th through 7th in Anaheim, California, come meet us in person at booth number 477 at MD&M West so we can show you how others are using the Greenlight Guru Medical Device Quality Management System platform to pass their certification audits and achieve true quality. All right, so let's get on to today's presentation and let me give you a proper introduction to today's presenter and our partners here at Greenlight R&Q. Today's speaker is Brian Hockett, project engineer from R&Q. He is the perfect person to discuss today's topic and has developed strategies and plans to meet the EU MDR requirements for technical documentation, post-market surveillance, QMS, and more. He's experienced in many different areas and has led quality system updates and implementation for ISO certification, FDA, and notified body preparation. He also has the benefit of working with very small as well as incredibly large companies. We encourage you to take advantage of Brian's time today and ask questions. R&Q's mission is to improve people's lives by bringing more safe and effective medical devices and combination products to market. R&Q's industry-leading consulting and engineering services assist clients in areas of regulatory quality systems, design assurance, product quality, and post-market surveillance. R&Q's been unsurprisingly heavily focused on EU MDR and CERs for quite some time now and offers project-based and staff augmentation services via team members who are skilled, adaptive, supportive, and focused on achieving project goals. When you hire R&Q, you never only receive the consultant or consultants working directly with your company, but the expertise of the full team behind them. So without further ado, let me hand it over to today's presenter, Brian Hockett.
All right, thanks, John. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. All right, well, today we're going to be discussing the new European medical device regulations and how to realistically start preparing for implementing these new requirements. So we're going to cover some background on the regulations, as well as key dates, timelines, and some limitations that are out there. We're also going to cover the past and how notified body involvement has changed for getting your device on the market. And then for the remainder of the webinar, we're going to talk about what you should do to start preparing for the MDR and what our experience was with a pilot submission. So John, if you could, we do have a couple polling questions that we want to put up throughout today just to get a little bit of an understanding of where you are with your EU MDR preparation. So John, I don't know if you'd be able to pull up poll question number one.
Yeah, I just had to unmute myself. So first poll question, how long has your organization been working on the transition from EU MDD to EU MDR? So folks, take a moment and provide your response. It's kind of fun sitting in my seat, Brian. I get to see the results come in real time. So
that's very fun.
It's another few seconds. All right. So there are the results. Can you see that, Brian, on your end?
I cannot.
All right. So 32% haven't started yet. 22% are 0 to 3 months. 16% 3 to 6 months. 29% are 6+ months, and only 2% have finished the transition.
That's great. Kudos to those 2% that have finished. That's a great feat. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. So, obviously, as you're all well aware, the population of the EU is very similar to the population of the US, Canada, and Japan. So it's a market you can't ignore anymore, and these changes are definitely impacting how your devices are going to be regulated. So the scales have shifted in the EU from really a low level of control to a very high level of control. And it's really been driven by a few issues like the PIP breast implant issues and metal-on-metal hips. So these issues really led to more prescriptive regulations and increased oversight, more scrutiny on your devices that are placed on the market. So they've shifted from a directive, which has to be transposed into the various national laws throughout the European Union, to a regulation which becomes immediately enforceable as law in all member states. So as a regulation, this also has European Commission oversight, where the directives really did not. So to put it in a little bit of perspective, the MDD was about 60 pages, whereas the new MDR regulation is 178. That's over 100 more pages of requirements. So in addition, a lot of the standalone guidance documents or MedDevs that you might have been familiar with have been incorporated into this regulation itself, which helps to really account for a lot of that increased content volume between the directives and the regulation. The other thing that the regulations are striving to do is really tighten the requirements on the standards for the notified body. So they are facing a lot more scrutiny as well. So historically, the European Commission's approach to medical device governance was seen a little bit more laissez-faire in comparison to some of the agencies like the FDA or Canada, Japan, Australia, and Brazil. So one of the objectives of this new EU MDR was to ensure a high level of health and safety protection for EU citizens. So they want to make the requirements much more stringent, which is aimed at improving health and safety throughout transparency and traceability of these devices. Now, it's important to keep in mind that we're still early in the process. There's still a lot of delegating acts and implementing acts that are expected before the MDR can be fully adopted and realized. So in layman's terms, those delegated acts are really what help legislate upon the what. They represent a decision by the EU legislators to grant the Commission power to act on a certain issue, whereas implementing acts are really what are used to ensure uniform conditions. The uniform conditions are needed to implement legally binding union acts. So we fully expect other guidance documents and perhaps templates that will be provided on the MDR similar to the MDD, but a lot of those have not been released yet. So this slide just goes through a lot of the high-level changes or the new requirements you might see or have seen or heard about as part of the MDR. We're going to go through a lot of these in a little bit more in depth throughout the presentation, but just wanted to touch on a couple here. So obviously there's an increased QMS requirements for this. There's this new responsible person that we'll talk about. Economic operators is a new term that's required that defines a certain group of companies, individuals that are responsible for devices, that they now also have some increased responsibility for complaint handling and things like that now. There's going to be, or there are, new classification rules and changes to existing classifications for high-risk devices. The essential requirements have been replaced by this new general safety and performance requirements that are much more extensive. There's a greater emphasis on clinical data, clinical evidence, clinical evaluation, and post-market clinical follow-up than there was previously. Manufacturers are going to face more scrutiny in their technical documentation, and notified bodies are expected to have additional expertise that they didn't have before in each device category that they're reviewing. There's a greater emphasis placed on control of reprocessing and reuse of devices. They're introducing new unique device identifier requirements similar to the FDA, but slightly different, of course. There'll be new specific post-market surveillance document requirements specific to devices, not for your whole system, not only for your whole system. So, and there's more that are even further expounded on that we'll talk a little bit later about. So the first thing we want to touch on is the quality management system, the base for a lot of your devices. So while compliance with ISO 1345:2016 addresses a lot of the new requirements under the MDR, there's still some additional key requirements which have to be addressed by the QMS that you should be aware of. So manufacturers are going to have to document a strategy for regulatory compliance, including compliance with conformity assessment procedures. Outside of, again, 13485, manufacturers have to verify UDI assignments for devices, both initially as the devices are launched and then periodically after the device is released. Manufacturers are going to have to designate a person or group of people, as we mentioned, responsible for regulatory compliance, often referred to as the person responsible. Companies are going to have to document procedures for clinical evaluation and investigation if that applies to your devices. And then you're going to have to create specific post-market surveillance documents such as PMS plans, post-market surveillance reports, or these new documents called periodic safety update reports that we're going to discuss a little bit later in the presentation. So we've included this little chart here just to show you or highlight a few of the key areas where most of the gaps are found and the areas of the regulation that are significantly revised or new requirements. So again, as we've talked, you've got some areas that are within the QMS structure, some within management controls, some within realization, and some within your measurement, analysis, and improvement. But this is really just a reference for you to look through and come back in the future that provides a little bit more detail into kind of the major areas that you might see differences between 1345 and the new MDR requirements. Again, major QMS processes that are affected. We added a little bit of more clarity between what clause you might expect to see in ISO 1345 and where you find similar verbiage or requirements within the MDR. So as you can see that there's a lot of similarities between the two, or a lot of the requirements that are covered by 1345:2016. But again, those that we showed on the last slide really highlight some of the nuances with the MDR that are different than what you would experience with 1345:2016. We mentioned before this responsible person for regulatory compliance. So this person has to be defined now. Every manufacturer has to have this person on staff or continuously at their disposal based on the size of the organization. So smaller organizations can have this person continuously at their disposal. This person has to also meet certain experience and educational requirements, such as having a scientific degree or a specific number of years of professional experience. So this person is responsible for really product conformity with the regulations, the technical documentation, declarations of conformity, and ensuring that appropriate reporting and post-market surveillance activities are taking place. Economic operators. So this is a new term to the MDR, these economic operators. So they're the manufacturer, the authorized rep, the importer, the distributor, and then also, if it applies to a person who puts together or sterilizes systems or procedure packs, which is defined within Article 22 of the MDR. So while manufacturers have really always had responsibility for the medical device, the requirements for other economic operators are really greatly expanded and clearly defined within the MDR. So each economic operator, as you can see here, has a specific section of the MDR which defines a lot of the requirements that they have to now meet. So here is just a slide to highlight a few of those changes, some of the key new requirements that economic operators should be preparing for. So certain economic operators have to register in this new UDIAmed database that we'll talk about a little bit later, but that's similar to the FDA registration that you might experience now, but that's the authorized rep and the importer. Authorized reps also have to designate a person responsible for regulatory compliance, just like the manufacturer. Authorized reps now have to have access to and keep a copy of the entire technical documentation for your device. And then the authorized reps, importers, and distributors now have defined responsibilities for defective product complaints and then verification of the manufacturer's documentation, such as the declaration of conformity or that the device is actually CE marked. So many of these entities have never had to comply with this level of regulation before. So it's going to be critical for manufacturers to start evaluating their partnerships and really determine if their partner is able to meet these new requirements, or if you need to start making changes now, because we know that can always take more time than you anticipate. Classification changes. So there's been a number of devices that have been reclassified or upclassified to Class 3 designations, as well as a number of existing Class 3 devices that have been clarified. These classification rules of the MDR are all found in Annex 8, if you wanted to go through them more in depth. But you should really take some time to review devices and determine if any of the devices that you have changed classification and really might require some additional data or information because of that new classification. Now, when you're reviewing these devices, we really want to stress that it's important to keep in mind the actual indications for your devices. The MDR offers some very specific definitions of areas or anatomy that they refer to. So, for example, you may think that because your device contacts the central nervous system or central circulatory system, it's now a Class 3 device. But the MDR contains very, again, specific definitions for the central circulatory system or the central nervous system. And if your device doesn't contact those specific areas, it might not be a Class 3 device. So you don't want to jump the gun and just assume that because you contact the circulatory system or something like that, that your device has automatically been upclassified. So pay particular attention to that as you're looking at your devices and really assessing what class your devices are under the new MDR requirements. As we talked about, the general safety and performance requirements are replacing the essential requirements that you're familiar with now. So they really perform the same function as the essential requirements. They define the minimum requirements that have to be considered and addressed when you're developing a medical device. The requirements are similar between the essential requirements. And as far as the sections are concerned, the chapters are still very similar, but there are significantly more requirements, and now some of the old requirements that you have been used to have really been bolstered. So while many of them, the new or expanded requirements have already been included or required maybe as best practices under the MDD, the GSPR aims to really call them out and make them part of the regulation so that there's no differences in those best practices. So we really see an emphasis on state-of-the-art or best practices used in other devices of the same or similar type, as well as some additional requirements for chemical, physical, and biologic properties. You're going to be required to have more information on carcinogenic, mutagenic, toxic to reproduction, and endocrine disrupting substances or residuals on the devices that you supply. Active and active implantable device requirements have been added, as well as some additional software requirements. There's also a significant increase in labeling and IFU requirements, as well as reference to the requirements of implant cards or for implantable devices. Excuse me. So Section 1 under general requirements are really very similar to the essential requirements from the MDD. Some of the key differences are really the emphasis on risk management and state-of-the-art assessments, intended to ensure that compliance is maintained over time and not just a one-time evaluation that you kind of set it and forget it. So, but this section should really look similar to the directives. Chapter 2, the design and manufacture section, contains a lot more modified requirements that are especially applicable to certain devices, kind of shown in this diagram. So there's really, as we mentioned, a greater emphasis on chemical composition of the device. This extends to medicinal substances that are incorporated into a device and may be absorbed or distributed from the device. There's also an emphasis on how the device interacts with other devices or how it might interfere with other devices, including things like airport screening or something like that, and then how it will be disposed of at the end of its life cycle, more than just calling out the specific regulations within general regulations, that they're really looking for more specific information on how to dispose of that device. So as you can see, there's a lot more information, a lot more testing, a lot more considerations that you might have within these that you're going to have to address as part of the general safety and performance requirements. The last area, the information supplied with the device, this area has added a significant number of labeling requirements for products. It includes, product labels, package labels, IFUs, manuals. Some of these requirements are due to the new inclusion of unique device identifiers that we're going to talk about in a little bit, but also there's new requirements for information on the substances on or in the device, especially for implantable devices, specific material information that you have to provide, and then more specific instructions and warnings for the device, as well as conveyance of residual risks that the device still has within, can be conveyed on the actual labeling or in the IFU itself. So it's important to note that while a lot of the labeling requirements are included in the GSPRs, there's still some additional information for labeling outlined in other articles, such as the fact that importers now have to be on the labeling of the device, or at least supplied with the device, as well as their actual address as well. So just some other things to be considering that as you're going through these devices and their requirements. So, as we mentioned before, the MDR has really placed a greater emphasis on clinical evidence. This clinical evidence is going to need to demonstrate safety and intended clinical benefits of the positive effect on patients' health when used as intended by the manufacturer. So this clinical evidence that's defined in the MDR is really a combination of clinical data and clinical evaluation. So manufacturers are going to have a sufficient amount and quality of evidence and data to allow a qualified assessment of whether the device is safe and achieves its intended clinical benefits when used as intended. One of the big changes under this new paradigm is that equivalence arguments are going to be harder to make, and in a lot of cases are no longer going to be accepted. So for example, there's not only requirements or explicit comparisons between devices that have to be made for equivalence, but manufacturers of Class 3 and implantable devices have to have an agreement in place with the manufacturer of the equivalent device, granting them access to all the technical documentation. Otherwise, clinical data is going to be required on the device itself. So if you have a device that's been up-classified, or if you think you might have a device that's going to require some clinical data, the best thing you can do today is to start collecting the data as soon as possible. Consider using things like user feedback, surveys, to start obtaining at least some clinical data. Post-market clinical follow-up can really be a powerful tool you can start using today to gain this information, retrospective studies, things like that. The goal is to give you the most amount of time to collect the needed clinical data in order to support your device. And the sooner you start, the better off you'll be. Requirements for clinical investigations have changed slightly. While the directives had a limited amount of information on the clinical investigations, most of the information was already found in the MedDevs 2.7/4, the guidelines on clinical investigation. So the MDR has really taken a lot of that MedDev and incorporated the guidance into the regulations with a few key additions that we wanted to make you aware of. So UDIAmed is now going to be used. This European Medical Device Database we're going to talk about will be used to obtain a single identification number, submit applications, and for serious event reporting for these clinical investigations. It's going to be similar to what you might experience in the FDA, but it's intended to help make things a little bit more transparent throughout the union. So the clinical investigation plan is now going to need to include reference to the clinical evaluation plan. So again, that's the investigation plan. It's going to need to include a reference to the evaluation plan, as well as include information about the financing of the study and agreements between sponsors and sites, which is a little bit more than what was required previously. And then studies are also going to need an investigator's brochure, which has a lot more information. So if you've been relying on the user manual in the past, it's no longer going to be adequate. Just a few key areas to be aware of there. On top of all of the changes and the requirements for technical documentation, notified bodies' assessments of the technical documentation are going to be scrutinized even more. Notified bodies are required to have sampling plans to ensure that all devices from each category or family devices are reviewed over time. So any device that's covered by a certificate will have to be reviewed over the time period for that certificate. So for example, for a 5-year certificate, all technical documentation for devices manufactured by a company have to be reviewed by that time. So there's no longer going to be any files that have sat on the shelf for years, never been reviewed or never touched because they're old or maybe they were acquired and haven't been updated to the latest procedures and requirements. They're all going to be looked at over time. And now, again, just as a reminder, those authorized reps, competent authorities are going to need to have access to this technical documentation as well. So just something to keep in mind. One specific area that we wanted to touch on here was the addition of these common specifications, or this new concept that's introduced in the MDR. So these common specifications are going to be a set of technical or clinical requirements other than a standard that provides a means for complying with the legal obligations applicable to a device, a process, or maybe a system. These aren't going to replace standards, but they're going to be used in conjunction with standards, or maybe in place of a standard, where a standard doesn't exist. They're really aimed to help provide consistency and ensure public health and safety. So similar to standards, the expectation is going to be that manufacturers are going to declare conformity to these applicable specifications for the devices. So the big thing to be aware of here is that these documents are currently in development and haven't been released for publication. So the expectation is they're going to be developed according to risk and need over the next few months to years, but you're really going to need to be paying attention and watching as these common specifications come out for those that are potentially going to be applicable to your device or class, because you're going to need to consider declaring equivalence to those specifications, or declaring that you meet those specifications. So post-market surveillance is another area that has changed significantly, and the requirements have really increased. The MDR contains some specific requirements for these post-market surveillance plans and reports that they need to be created for each device or family of devices. They can't be a general post-market surveillance for all devices. They need to be specific. They also have specific content requirements as well. This chart that you see here shows really an overview of the post-market surveillance reports and some key other documentation that's tied to and intertwined with post-market surveillance that's going to need to be created or updated as part of the new post-market surveillance requirements. So these requirements, as you can see here, are based on the risk class of the device. So class 1 devices, for example, are only going to require this post-market surveillance report. Class 2 and 3 devices are going to require this new document called a periodic safety update report, which contains all of the information from the post-market surveillance report, such as complaint data and information on the adverse events and history of the device over the reporting period. But it's also going to be required to have additional information about the risks, the risk benefits of the device, any post-market clinical follow-up activities, other key activities like CAPAs and information like that are all going to have to be included in this new periodic safety update report. And it's going to have to be redone every so often based on the risk class of the device. As you can see here, for a class 2A device, for example, you have to do it every 2 years. For a 2B and a class 3 device, you're going to have to do that periodic safety update report at least annually. So you can do them more often, but these are the minimum requirements. One thing that we wanted to also mention here, which is a new item that you're going to be doing as part of your post-market your post-market process for class 3 and implantable devices, is this new document called a Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance. This SSCP, or Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance, contains key information about the device, its use, its history, a summary of the clinical performance and evidence on the device, and it's intended really to be a public document that's available to lay people to help them be better informed about the device and its performance. So that's something to keep in mind. That, again, that's going to be submitted to a notified body. It's going to become public in this UDIAmed database. So really just a lot more requirements and information that are going to have to be part of your device process now. So unlike the MDD, based on the risk class, the MDR explicitly lays out these reporting frequency requirements for these reports. So just keep that in mind, that there is a specific frequency that you have to do, and it's not always able to be defined by the company unless it's a class 1 device. So vigilance requirements are very similar between the MDR and the directives with a few exceptions. All serious events must now be reported within 15 days instead of 30 days. So that's a little bit, or quite a bit of a shortening of the time period, but again, it's important to understand that those reports can be followed up with additional information later, so it's better to submit early, get within that 15 days, and then update those reports, those vigilance reports as you go. Field safety corrective actions, recalls, corrections, removals, those kind of things require notification, reporting to the competent authority prior to taking action now, so that's a big change. And then you need to notify them even if this field safety corrective action is taking place in a third-party country, so in another country outside the union or something like that, you still need to notify them of those actions. And then again, the MDR added some new requirements to the trending, that the trends that you're assessing on the devices or on the complaint history or whatever your post-market data is, that you're assessing those, the frequency of that, and it needs to be a statistically significant change, as well as you need to be evaluating changes in potential severity. All need to be considered for trends, not just the frequency of those trends or complaints or issues that you're seeing in the field. Competent authorities, just wanted to mention here quickly that they have a little bit more authority than they had in the past. Again, they're still going to continue to do unannounced and announced audits. That's going to extend to all economic operators, plus again your key suppliers and subcontractors. And they have the ability to confiscate, destroy, or otherwise render inoperable devices if they see fit or have reason to believe that it's a device that doesn't meet the requirements. We've talked a little bit about it, but wanted to just highlight the unique device identification, UDI, that's going to be required now, very similar to the FDA. So the MDR also adds a requirement for something called a basic UDI, which will serve as more of a device type identifier specific to a company. So for example, an orthopedic company that might have a lot of individual UDIs for all their bone plates, they're going to have an overall basic UDI for all bone plates, one UDI to cover all of them, but they're still going to have their specific individual UDIs for every individual SKU that they offer. Reusable devices, which require cleaning, disinfection, sterilization, or refurbishing between patient use, must bear the UDI on the device, just very similar to the FDA, but it's important to note that this is a wider scope than the FDA, so you may need to check your device for compliance. UDI information is going to have to be uploaded in this UDIAMed database that we're going to talk about, again, similar to the Good ID upload for the FDA. The good news is that there's at least an 18-month grace period after the release of the MDR, so in May of 2020, or after UDIAMed goes live, for manufacturers to get this information into the database. So it doesn't have to be populated right on day one or leading up to day one. You have an 18-month grace period to upload that information into the database. Also similar to how the FDA rolled out UDI, the devices are going to be need to be assigned to UDI, but they have a rolling compliance date for when they actually need to be on the label, and even longer for when the device has to physically have the UDI on the reusable devices. So those reusable devices have 2 years past the dates that are listed, as you see on the screen, when the device has to have the UDI on the label. And the good news, the silver lining out of all this, is that the EU is utilizing the same accrediting or issuing agencies. So as long as you're using the GS1 or the HIPIC or have those already defined, you're not going to have to issue separate EU-specific UDI codes. UDIAMed, that we've talked a lot about, it's intended to be a public forum for the manufacturers, distributors, authorized representatives, competent authorities, and the European Commission to really augment cooperation and information exchange. It's intended for more than just registration. So some examples, as we've talked about, include economic operator registration, unique device identification, upload registration. Your vigilance reports are going to be through this, your field safety corrective actions, information on clinical investigations, post-market surveillance documents are going to be uploaded in this, summary of safety and clinical performance. So again, a lot of information. The important thing to note here is that the database is still under development. So we're starting to see some guidance about the data elements and information about that, but it's still under development. It's not scheduled to go live until around March of 2020, so just a couple months before that EU MDR go live date. So it's still under construction, so again, beware of changes and updates and information that's going to be forthcoming, hopefully here in the next few months to years. All right, just wanted to take a quick break when I've been doing a lot of talking, so I'll have John pull up our next polling question for you guys to answer. Again, just wanted to gauge some of the experience with EU MDR.
All right. The next polling question is your organization currently marketing product in the EU? Give it a few more seconds. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll. And results, 76% yes, 4% no, but will in 2019, 12% no, but will in 2020, 9% no, we're waiting until after the MDR is in effect.
That's good to know. So sounds like a majority of you though already have devices on the market, so it's good to know. Excuse me. So the next thing I want to talk about are the key dates, timelines, and limitations. So this timeline really shows the major important dates. While most are aware that the MDR goes into effect on May 26th of 2020, there's still several other key dates and requirements that you should be aware of that might impact your devices. So notified bodies acceptance of submissions for MDD files. Keep in mind there's going to be less notified bodies. As of September 2018, there's only a little more than 30 notified bodies that have applied for certification. So that's a drastic reduction in the number of notified bodies. So you want to make sure that your notified body has applied or is planning on applying, especially if you're marketing those devices already in the EU. Notified bodies have also started to announce the last dates they're going to accept submissions for MDD renewals. Some of those notified bodies are as early as March of this year, March of 2019. Some are out into November. So just keep in mind, you want to keep in constant communication with that notified body to understand when you can submit those higher risk class devices for review and how long those reviews are going to take, because you want to make sure that you provide adequate time, as we also know that with all of the activities and scrutiny that the notified bodies are facing during their certification to MDR, that their timelines are drastically increasing in a lot of cases. So just be aware that that might impact your submission schedule or what you're going to be doing to prepare for EU MDR. So you really don't want to wait right up until May of 2020 just before you start submitting your renewals. MDD site audits are still going to continue as the date of application approaches for the MDR, but the number of, again, qualified notified bodies is decreasing, so longer time frames. So you want to get those reviews scheduled as soon as you can. So while the MDR does go into effect on May 26th of 2020, not everything is required on day one. So if you have an existing Class 1 sterile, Class 1 measurable, Class 2 or Class 3 devices with a valid MDD cert, those devices can still be sold on the market as long as their certificate remains valid. But one thing I do want to highlight here is this new defined Class 1 reusable surgical devices. They're going to need a valid MDR certificate. They did not exist under the medical device directives, but they will need a certificate under the MDR. So that may force you to be compliant much sooner, because on day one, those devices are going to need to have a certificate from your notified body in order to keep selling those devices. So that could be a big gap, or may move them up the chain as far as the risk is concerned. You can't have any significant design changes to the device during this time frame if you're still selling an MDD device on the market. If you make a significant change, the device has to be submitted for MDR. Now, it's important to note that the MDR doesn't really define what constitutes a significant change. It's really up to you, the manufacturer, and the notified body to determine to evaluate that change. It's also important to note that it means that no new device can be released after that date, or any new device that's released after that date has to be MDR compliant. And then again, manufacturers, authorized reps, importers, distributors have to register within that 18-month time frame in the Eudamed database. And then you're also going to have to do these post-market surveillance reports, so that either a post-market surveillance report or a PSUR plus your post-market surveillance plans, depending on the class of your device. And then you're going to need to follow the new vigilance reporting requirements, so that 15-day requirement instead of the 30-day requirement, in order to keep selling those devices. The last date a manufacturer can put a device on the market under the MDD is May 26th of 2024. Now, if your devices are already in the supply chain, they can stay out in the market until May of 2025, but you as a manufacturer can't put them in the supply chain after 2024, but then after May of 2025, no MDD device can be available on the market. So when you start to put that, all of the information, all those key dates and timelines that you've seen on the market, you start to get a little bit better picture of all of these required dates for compliance. I wanted to touch briefly on conformity assessments and the notified body involvement next. So previously the MDD had a lot of confusing amount of conformity assessment paths and methods to place the device on the market. While it can still be a little bit confusing, the MDR aimed to simplify this process. So as you can see here, the MDR has, as we talked about, added several new device classes. There's Class 1 reusable surgical instruments, and then custom Class 3 implants that now require notified body involvement and assessment where they did not previously before, so you can't self-certify, if they're familiar with that, those types of devices anymore. So the next few slides are really provided more for reference, just the conformity assessment path. I do want to jump ahead to this last slide here, which has all of the slides together. So as you can see, everything's going to require that technical documentation. But I want you to pay particular attention to that little chart over on the right-hand side. It talks about, as we mentioned, that notified bodies have now schedules and have to review all of your devices. But the MDR also defines minimum requirements based on the classification or the category of your device that the notified body is going to have to assess when they look or aim to certify a device. So as you can see, implantable devices, every device, for example, has to be reviewed. But if you have a Class 2B device that's not implantable, you only have to have one generic device type reviewed in order to obtain that certificate or during your assessment. Now, again, keep in mind, this is only the minimums. So the notified bodies can look at more. They could look at all of them if they wanted to. But again, this is minimums that have to be reviewed. So that may be a little bit different than what your experience is in the past. The other thing I want to touch on is with all of these conformity assessment paths and everything, it can be a little confusing as to what the notified body may actually want to come in and audit. So it may look different than your conformity assessment path. But the notified body has to ensure they're assessing everything they're required to review by the MDR. So their assessment may need to be done by different people because they have to have expertise in specific fields. So this is just one example from BSI that shows based on the class of the device and other information that what they're actually going to want to come in and audit. So you might have a quality management audit, a microbiology, and a technical documentation audit, and an unannounced audit, all for this one device for a Class 3 device. So there's a lot of different assessments that they may come and do, all to generate these certificates that you're going to need for your devices. So it's just a continuation of that example from BSI. We did want to touch on, since there was a vote yesterday, the impact of Brexit and why it matters. So hopefully all of you are familiar with Brexit and what's happening within the EU and the UK. But what we saw yesterday with the vote was that there is going to be no deal for when the UK leaves the European Union. So that has an important impact because there are not only impact to manufacturers in Britain, but it also impacts notified bodies and authorized reps, again, that as they have to be established in the union and under the national law of a member state. So if you have an authorized rep or a notified body that's part of Britain, this may have a significant impact on your devices, especially if they do end up in a no-deal situation. So luckily, the UK has released guidance on that. They just updated this in January, so that there's at least a post-Brexit relationship with the EU still needs to be worked out. But if there's at least no deal, there's some guidance on how the UK is going to handle that. So a couple key things to highlight here is that the UK will recognize approved CE mark devices for a limited time. But the important thing that you're going to have to be aware of is that medical devices are going to need to be registered with MHRA within this grace period that you can see here. So 4, 8, or 12 months, depending on the class of your device. So those are a couple key things that you just need to be aware of as they transition, and something to be mindful of. And in a lot of cases, if you have a notified body that's part of the UK, they might actually already be indicating to you that you might need to be switching your address to one of their other sites if they have it that's established within the union. So just be aware of that might require a lot of work in the next few months to keep these devices on the market. All right, so the last thing we want to cover is where to start, what to do next. So really, you need to train the individuals on the new requirements and their impact. You can't assess the impact if you don't know the requirements. This is going to require coordinating and managing efforts across multiple departments and individuals. And there's too much interconnectivity in the regulations for tasks to be worked out in silos. Assign an owner to lead the planning, assessment, remediation processes. If you want to do some portfolio planning, the goal is really to understand effort versus impact. The MDR, hands down, is going to take more effort, but is it worth the cost? You want to make sure you understand the true impact, considering even global registrations based off the EU. With only, you want to evaluate and assess what's needed. With only a few products, a high-level layout of estimates of costs or might be all that's needed, but for a lot of products, you might need a more in-depth gap assessment that can really help you understand exactly where you're going to need to remediate some files. So you want to consider the number of files you have, their complexity, and really the best next step may be starting remediation right out of the gate if you only have a few, and everything has to move forward. Consider the impact of Brexit. Renew your Class 3 devices under the MDD as soon as you can. Submit them as soon as you can, as soon as you feel comfortable. Renew early. It gives you the longest amount of time to be compliant. Start with your high priority devices. You want to establish an MDR strategy. Make sure you're considering key product launches, when devices need to be put on the market, when your certificates expire, and on top of that, how long your notified body is actually taking to assess those files. If their lead times are lengthening out, that might move up when you need to submit. And don't forget about those Class 1 reusable surgical instruments that may force you to have a compliant quality management system up and running much sooner than you might have to for your Class 2 or 3 devices. And then if you need clinical data, start now as soon as you can. It provides the most time for that data to be collected and the most amount of time for you to transition. So this slide really is just some of the key activities, really for your reference, just to be thinking about over the next few years in 2019, 2020, as we lead up to the date of application, even after that application, the date of application of the MDR. So just some key things, again, training, portfolio planning, remediation, post-market surveillance activities to be starting as soon as you can, just to be thinking about in general for the next few months. So I know we're getting close to time, so I just wanted to run through really quick here our experience from a pilot submission. So we were fortunate enough to conduct a pilot submission with a notified body before they stopped doing them. I want you to keep in mind that this product was reviewed less than 2 years ago and was submitted without addressing any of the weaknesses in the file to help with calibration. So some of the things that we wanted to draw up for you was that everything was reviewed as if it was never reviewed before. So there was no grandfathering. For example, the CER had to be all-encompassing. Couldn't be just a delta or a change from the last one. It had to go all the way back to the pre-market data that supported the device in its assessment. All of those files, all of that literature had to be included. It was very hard to take old test reports and treat them as if they were new. So the tests may have had poor quality, lacked documentation on justifications of sample sizes, or would have met old standards. So there was a lot of questions around justifying sample sizes, materials used, linking to what materials are used today. We also had problems with test reports not referencing the version of the standard used and having weak rationales or testing not updated to standards. So that's something to keep in mind, that you might have to do a lot more justifications of differences in standard revisions. Common specifications are something you're going to need to consider. Notified body indicated that there might be some technical standards that are not harmonized standards that might be designated as common specifications. So keep that in mind, that all of this, again, was not questioned less than 2 years ago when this specific dossier was reviewed. Again, there was a significant amount of effort to generate the new required documentation to support material composition changes, so potential impurities. Again, as we mentioned, that carcinogenic, mutagenic information, and the notified body came back with new questions on absorptions of coatings and things like that were on the device that were never previously asked, and this was not a new change to the device. We wrote the first PSER and PMS plans based on the MDR. We didn't really get any questions on that. We hear that there will be a template, but we were happy to receive no questions on that, so we're hoping we just got it right the first time. Again, the notified body wanted to know what testing was actually done to support the safe disposal of the device, and then there was a greater emphasis on understanding the history of the device. For this specific summary, safety and clinical performance, they wanted to know information on how the device evolved from previous devices. They didn't want the company to be able to take a device with significant issues, make some minor change, rename it, and present it like a new device. The intent was for users to be more informed. And then really overall, the notified body encouraged us to understand the intent of the regulations and during our interaction with them, they said that they're still interpreting the regulations, that they're still figuring out best practices and how to satisfy this. So some of this is going to come through implementing acts, but they're really not established yet. So there's more calibration that needs to happen. So key takeaways here, consider your staff, divide the work. Planning is going to be crucial to managing your costs and efforts. Consider renewing your medical device, your existing medical devices early to give you the longest possible transition time. You want to make sure that you have a strategy, that you've assessed your devices, and make sure that you've got an appropriate priority list and timing, considering the timing of your new product launches and implementation for some of the new Vigilance and Eudamed requirements. You can use tools, templates to collect your data consistently. Review all of your technical documentation for compliance. Don't assume that everything is okay just because it was reviewed, in the near past. And then if you think you need clinical data, start as soon as you can. Last thing, real quick, I know we're getting close on time, is we just have provided for reference for the future a couple public resources that are available on the European Commission's website. If you go there and look at some of the guidance documents that have been released, this is just some of the information that has come out so far. And again, we're hoping that more to come. So with that, thank you for your time, and I believe we still have some time for questions, John.
Yes, we do actually. So let me get to those questions. Got to click on the right button again. And there are quite a few. I actually had one myself. I mean, this notion of person responsible for regulatory compliance. I mean, I realize that this is kind of new within the EU MDR, but I mean, is there anything that's really changed as far as the expected behavior?
I think that they're really just trying to ensure that someone is taking responsibility for it. A lot of times it's VP of regulatory or VP of quality that's typically, done the actual work of that or ensured that. But I think now they're just looking for that to be defined. They want to make sure that that person has expertise. So especially in smaller companies or startups or things like that where they may not have had the experience, they're really looking to make that more consistent to ensure that there's at least some experience with regulated medical devices. But I don't know that it's that necessarily, other than having to designate the person and identify them when their submissions for their certificates, that it's going to impact them that significantly. Now, it may have a more significant impact on your authorized rep, but again, I don't see it having a huge impact on manufacturers.
Brian, I did have somebody ask me this the other day on that topic. Is this a role that can be outsourced to a third party? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yep, no, and the MDR actually defines who can outsource that. So for small companies, and I apologize, I can't remember the exact number, but so they're within the MDR, they define and they make reference to another regulation which defines a small and essentially what small and medium-sized companies are that can have, I believe it's less than 50 employees and no more than, I think, $1 million or $10 million in sales, that can outsource that. If you're a larger organization, and we can get the specifics on that, but if you're a larger organization, essentially, you cannot outsource that role. That has to be someone internal to your organization.
All right, thanks for the clarification. And yes, there are several questions or comments about, will you get access to the presentation, the slides, and so on? Yes, once we wrap up today's session, you'll get an email with a link to the replay that you'll get to go through the slides that Brian and the R&Q team have spent so much time preparing. And Brian, thank you. First of all, it was terrific. I jotted down quite a few notes and some really things that are new that I think are important. And folks, this will be sent to you. And for those of you who have friends or colleagues who maybe didn't have a chance to go through today's session, encourage them to go to the Greenlight Guru website. Here in a few days, this will be available on demand as well. So let's dive into the questions. Heather has a question, and I think this is probably an important one. What is the difference between a directive and a regulation?
Yeah, so the directives have to be, they're done by the European Commission, but they're not immediately enforceable as law. So the national competent authorities within each of the member states, so the 27 or so member state, well, maybe 26, member states have to then transpose them into national law. So what you end up with is slight differences or slight maybe interpretation differences between each of those competent authorities that you now still have to follow. So the difference with the regulation is it's an immediate law, so there's no transposition by those national bodies of these regulations into their own law. It's immediately enforceable as law. So you don't have, okay, well, it's different in Germany and different in France and slightly different in the UK or slightly different in, in some other country. It's immediately enforceable as law, whereas the directives, they were not that way. They still had to be transposed.
Okay.
So you end up with a lot less differences across the union.
Gotcha. Matsuro asked how and when the Annex ZZs would go for harmonized standards correspondence with the essential requirements in MDR.
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, so how and when will the Annex ZZs go for harmonized standards correspondence with essential requirements in MDR? I don't know if that makes sense to you. It's not entirely clear to me.
It's not entirely clear to me. Maybe that's one that we could answer later on email.
Okay. So Mitsuru, reach out to Brian. Brian, I don't. What's the best way for folks to get a hold of you? Is there a contact slide that might be good to show while I'm going to the next question?
We don't have that, or I didn't know if we'll. So we'll have so any of the questions that we don't get answered right, we'll be able to answer and maybe go through and read that, and then we can provide that in that email as well as we blast that out to everybody. We can give our contact info out in that. That would be great.
All right, terrific. So let's get to the next question. Andrew wants to know why some of your notes were in red.
So some of those were just to highlight. So for example, like on the Vigilance slide, those are red just to highlight the key differences. That some of the requirements are the same, but some of them are specifically different, like the Vigilance slide where it was 15 days as opposed to how it used to be 30 days, or some of the new requirements that were added for trending or notification of field safety corrective actions in third-party countries. So that's really just to highlight some of the differences or some of the changes where the text may look very similar in the MDR, but that there are some key differences in the MDR.
All right. So Devin asked a question. How far do these changes reach into RUO life science tools?
That's a great question. I need to think about that. So
I'm guessing that probably has more applicability in the IVDR, I would guess, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the whole separate other regulation. It's separate from this that has, again, a lot more, as you said, impact as a lot of those devices haven't been regulated in that level before. So even the manufacturers themselves are not used to that level of regulation. So that's going to have a very significant impact on that way.
And Brian, I correct any assumptions that I misstate, but R&Q not only helps companies with EU MDR, but I'm assuming R&Q could also help companies with their EU IVDR strategy as well.
Yep, absolutely. That's absolutely something that we're starting to focus on internally as well. I know, and there's as we even saw in some of the polling, there's fewer companies that are preparing farther out for that, but that's definitely something that we're able to help with and putting a key focus on as well. Is that EU IVDR.
So Devin, I know that Brian and the R&Q team will be following up with you, but I would also encourage you to be proactive and reach out to the R&Q team. This is their area of expertise. Next question comes from Ali. Ali states, we have received feedback at other trainings that the person responsible for regulatory compliance should be, quote, independent, and have received conflicting feedback on what independent means. Can you elaborate on any requirements you are aware of for this? And your thoughts on having the VP that is responsible for RAQA be this person?
Yeah, so as far as the independence, what our understanding is that they can't have any negative impact on their position, their job, their bonus or anything like that be negatively impacted based on the decisions that they have to make. For example, they couldn't have their bonus docked because they refuse to let out a product that they don't feel is in compliance with the regulation. So launch dates get missed, sales targets get missed, so now they're going to have some repercussions because of that they can't suffer any repercussions because of those decisions that they have to make. So that's kind of the independence that our experience has been that they need to establish that they don't need to be an independent person or an independent entity, but that they have to be independent enough to where they can make those sometimes difficult decisions without having any ill will or any negative repercussions on their job or their performance or anything like that, based on those decisions that they have to make.
All right, that makes sense. Heather wants to know, has the EU Commission formulated an official GSPR form similar to the ERC?
No, we have not seen anything yet. We have some templates that we've started working on just based on the Annex 1 requirements that we've seen, similar to what maybe some people have done previously with the essential requirements, but no templates that we've seen. Again, the templates that they're developing are based on risk, so we're hoping that we might see some of the PCER templates first, but I would anticipate that the GSPRs are going to be further out. The only real things that we've seen the European Commission release are related to UDI and some of those elements or data elements that are going to be required and information around those. So nothing yet on GSPRs.
All right, so Tina asks, I think it's a very good question, and it's in alignment with your comment about the shrinking number of notified bodies. But Tina asks, notified bodies in the EU are having trouble keeping up with the current workload for tech file reviews. Do you know how this is going to be addressed, considering the increased requirements of the EU MDR, and I'll add in, and the reduced number of notified bodies?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And we're actually seeing, some notified bodies it's hitting harder than others. We've heard from some of the major notified bodies that are out there that their lead times are increasing, drastically on the order of almost, years type of lead time, where some others haven't seen the crunch. So a lot of what they're trying to do is hire as much and as fast as they can. But one thing that a company can do to be proactive, right, is submit a little bit earlier than you think. If you're able to, if your submission typically takes 3 months, probably plan on 6 months. We know that those timeframes are going to lengthen out. We know that notified bodies need to gain more experience themselves, so they're going to be slow themselves in reviewing these new files under the MDR. So plan more time is the only thing that we've really been able to do to help make sure that things still stay on track for launches or for certificate renewals and things like that. But they're really just trying to hire as fast as they can to get more auditors, more reviewers, things like that as best as they can. But some it's hitting very hard.
Okay. All right. Great. Let's go into the next question. And then I guess on the notified body, I know there's a place that one can go to find out the current list of notified bodies. Is there some keyword or combination keywords that one can type into a search engine to get to that relatively quickly to see if their notified body is still on the list?
There is. We can send that out with the answers. I can't think of the. So right now there's a group, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of the group, but there's a group of notified bodies that have kind of formed their own trade association, it's called, where they've listed the notified bodies that have applied or the ones that plan to apply for certification. That's where we get that list of about 33 or so. But there might be others that aren't on that list or aren't part of that group that have still submitted. But at least we can provide you that link to that site where those are listed, at least the ones that have planned to apply for that.
Yeah, that would probably be helpful. So Adnan's question, what work would you advise for self-certified Class 1 non-measuring, non-sterile, non-reusable?
So those devices have to be compliant on day one of the MDR, so that May 26, 2020 date. So that's where you're going to have that QMS up and running, your technical documentation, so post-market surveillance documentation, your GSPRs, your technical documentation requirements that are part of Annex 2. So Annex 2 and Annex 3 really detail those technical documentation requirements. So that's where you should focus on documenting those, Annex 1, 2, and 3, essentially, getting that done, getting that evidence shown for those Class 1 devices, and then focusing on your whatever QMS or quality procedures you have after that. But those will have to be compliant on that first day.
All right, terrific. So Pete has a question for drug device combination products. How much of the EU MDR applies, and is any of it redundant due to existing requirements for the pharmaceutical GMP?
Yeah, so there are multiple references. So there to the regulations for drugs in there, and then how they're going to actually regulate those combination products within there that we just didn't get into today. with combination products, at least I'm calling them the FDA. But there are also specific requirements within the general safety and performance requirements that add additional requirements for devices that elute or have medicines as part of them, maybe like a drug-eluting stent or something like that, that there's a lot more considerations within the MDR that have to be done and then that have to be considered and evaluated and documented as to how you're meeting those requirements. So yeah, so the MDR definitely does try and do a lot better job of tying that gap between those two.
Okay.
And then yep. Okay.
All right. So Brian, do you have time for maybe a few more questions? And there are quite a few more.
Yeah.
So folks, we'll get to a few more, and Brian and the R&Q team will be following up with you here very soon if you did ask a question. All right. So Matthias asked, will Eudamed be live and working when IVDR comes in place? Will there be a grace period?
That's great. I'm not as familiar with the IVDR, so I need to consult with our team. But I don't know. Again, I think there's a lot of questions around the Eudamed database, even whether or not it's going to be live in March of 2020. And I think there's a lot of skeptics that might say that it's really going to be past that. So I can't say for certain right now, but
I think we're all waiting with bated breath on that Eudamed. I mean, there's been a lot of
exactly.
hype about it, so I think we're all pretty anxious to see what that is and when that's going to be ready. So stay tuned, folks. And it's a good point. As much as and Brian, thank you again. This has been wonderful information, very insightful, but we're still flying a little bit of the dark on all of this, so it's still a very, very fluid environment. So as we get throughout the calendar year of this year, 2019 and beyond, I'm sure Greenlight Guru will be working more closely with R&Q and other partners to give you the latest, greatest information as it becomes available. Obviously, we're trying to pass this along to you because this is a big challenge for all of us in the industry, and it affects everybody in the EU with med devices. All right, so Neil asks, can a self-certified Class 1 device still be placed on the market during the transition period?
It cannot. It has to be, so because they're self-certified, because there's no notified body assessment, there's no certificate associated with it, they have to be compliant on day one. They have to be compliant that May 26, 2020 date.
All right, so let's wrap it up with one more question. This comes from Shaylee. Shaylee asks, can a CER also serve as a PSUR?
No, the CER unfortunately doesn't contain, at least in my experience from what I've seen, the amount of information. So there's also some details in there that, I don't know, I can't speak for how they do their CERs, but the, CAPAs and other information that's not typically, in my experience, included in a CER. Some analysis of trending and the complaint data that usually goes a lot more in depth than what you might experience in a CER. So it's seen right now, I think, as two separate documents, especially since certain PCERs are going to have to be submitted to the notified bodies on that annual basis for certain types of devices. So I think it would be smart to keep them separate, but that's not to say that you can't point to a lot of the sections within your CER in your PCER, for example, with the clinical literature and data and information from public databases that would typically be in your CER. You could definitely point to that from your PCER within your CER. So I think there's a lot of synergy there that you can point to and use your CER to contain a lot of it, but I think there's some more additional information that would warrant keeping those two documents separate.
All right, I fibbed a little. There's one other question. A couple of variations have come up on this. Looks like Tom and Harry have asked variations of this question, and it's intriguing. Harry says that he's heard that with the EU MDR that there could be challenges managing your QMS in a means other than electronic system in some way, shape, or form. So I guess the question really for you, Brian, if you can weigh in on how is a company going to be able to manage and address EU MDR requirements, especially things like CER and so on, if you do not have an EQMS platform in place?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be more challenging, especially with for example, even some of the creation of these post-market surveillance documents that require, a lot of data assessment, a lot of data diving, and looking into, your complaint history and your CAPAs, your NCs, and your non-conformances, or a lot of those things that are just going to be tracked better and accessed even for your authorized rep to your technical documentation, that are just going to make it harder. I don't think that it's going to be impossible, but I think it's definitely going to be harder. You're just going to have a lot more diligent systems in place for keeping up to date, whatever maybe spreadsheets or information or paper documents that you have, and be a lot more rigorous with ensuring that the latest version of that is disseminated to all of the required parties. And it's definitely going to be more challenging, but I don't think that it will be insurmountable.
All right, so let me once again thank Brian Hockett. Brian is a project engineer from R&Q. Obviously, he knows this stuff when it comes to the EU MDR. So I want to thank you, Brian, and R&Q for your time, effort, and energy in this. And folks, as always, if you have any questions, comments about ways to implement an EQMS to help your medical device company, I would encourage you to go to www.greenlight.guru and learn more about our medical device specific software platform designed by medical device professionals to help you manage those needs.